Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about how to overcome a score plateau, which is almost everyone's question at some point in their prep. If you don't hit a score plateau, you really haven't maximized your score. You have to hit that plateau and break through it, unless you're just, sort of intuitively adept at this and you're immediately in the top percentiles of scores. But what I think is tricky about the LSAT in general is that there's a ton of advice. Most of it's very good, and most of it's also very bad. It's a sort of a paradox question. How can it be good and bad? It's good in the sense that I rarely read an expert's opinion about the LSAT and think, no, that has no merit. Would never recommend that. But I think because this advice is usually devoid of context, you're not told when that advice is appropriate, it ends up being bad because you either employ it at the wrong time or you continue to reach for that advice after the advice has outlived its usefulness. So, what we have to talk about is not just what is my advice, but is it when is it good to apply that advice and when should you move on to different advice? Okay, so what I do to prep for these lessons is I go out and read what all the other experts are saying about things, and then I disagree with them uniformly. I think that's a product of the fact that you don't have a lot of educators in the LSAT prep space. What you have is a lot of good test takers and a lot of good business people who know how to market their test strategies. But you don't really have a lot of career teachers, people who've been university professors, law school professors. So I find much of the advice to be very bad, but I did find this one nugget of information that I thought was spot on. So I quoted it here. It says, if you are experiencing a score plateau, chances are you've gone as far as possible in improving your LSAT performance. And here's the caveat, while nevertheless keeping bad habits that are preventing you from doing even better. This is the trickiest thing, that people get really good and resist changing their reading habits. They want to know, how can I get a really good score while still being the bad reader that I was last year, the year before, or, in a pre-LSAT prep. And so my response to that is typically don't. Maybe you can. I think there's a lot of people out there that will sell you the gazelle and promise higher scores. But I think that many times those gimmicks are bad for you. They don't actually help you fix the bad habits, the bad reading habits that are preventing you from getting to the next level. All right, so let me give you guys a quick visual of what I think is going on when you hit a plateau. A typical story that I hear from students is that they start in the low scores, 140s or lower, and then usually they start studying and observe some immediate improvement. Whatever familiarity they're gaining with the test is helping. Whatever strategies they're learning are pushing them toward more and more right answers. And then eventually they reach a point where that stops working. In this particular graphic, that local maximum is 160. That's not everybody's local maximum. For some people, it's 140. For some people, it's 150. For some people, it's 170. But my point is that almost everybody hits that point where continuing to study does not continue to push your score higher and higher. And so here's the trap that people get into, right? You're starting here in the 140s, you're getting better, you're building confidence, and you're reading books, learning strategies. And then at some point, you start picking up some strategies that don't work. Your scores start coming down. You're on this downward slide here. What most students do is they panic. They go back to their bad strategies, and that starts working. Their scores start going back up toward the plateau. And then they think, okay, now I'm ready. They start thinking about, what can I do more? What can I do different? And their scores start coming down. So boom, they're right back to the old strategies. The confidence is coming back up to the plateau. Try to change, try to improve, scores come down. It's a vicious cycle. And so what I think students have to realize is that when you're implementing these new strategies from this maximum point to the minimum point, there's a period where you really don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to implement those strategies in an efficient way. You don't know when to implement those strategies. And so they end up hurting your score. But if you continue to refine, continue to think, and continue to build on high quality strategies, what eventually happens is that you make that turnaround and the score comes back up higher than the plateau because these strategies are better than these strategies. It's this period of uncertainty that kills everybody. Someone gives you some good advice, it doesn't work immediately, and then you think, oh, well, that's not good advice. Back to your bad reading habits. So that's why we developed triple review, because it forces students to slow down and it forces them to grapple with some of the skills rather than focusing on the scores. What I think is really interesting about this is students find it crazy the way that I teach. I don't care what your score is, and I don't care which questions you get wrong. And so people hear that and they're like, how in the world can you help me if we're not going to focus on my score and the questions that I get wrong? And my answer is because we're going to drop all the way down to the bottom line and we're going to talk about the quality of your reading skills and we're going to talk about the quality of your test taking skills. And whatever they are, I want to make them better. And I don't care if that hurts your score, because ultimately I know that those skills and those robust strategies are the things that are going to carry you through law school. And I also know that those strategies will enable you to break through the plateaus that you guys are experiencing. So it's a really hard sell for me to tell people, I want you to do something that's going to hurt your score for a little while. It's like strength training. If you work out every day, you're not as able to, to perform the following day, but you are building and eventually do surpass that point with diligent work. All right, so here's a list of things that I found on a website. And I wanted to talk about this list because I found these 6 bullet points. And I won't even mention the competitor who compiled this list, but I find every one of them to be wrong, not because the advice is bad, but because it lacks context. So let me explain what I mean. One of the pieces of advice that I read, and I read this frequently, you've hit a score plateau, take a break. The reason that's good advice is that many people hit a score plateau because they're burned out and they've been working so hard. But the reason it's bad advice is that taking a break doesn't allow you to come back with a better plan, a sustainable study plan. Instead, people tend to come back and then start studying the same way they were before, the same way that required them to take a break. If you have to take a break from your studying, something's wrong. That's not a sustainable program, a sustainable plan. It's like saying I have to take a break from my diet. You've chosen goals that are too ambitious if that's the case. Not that you can't plan for, opportunities to break the rules, but it's not breaking the rule if that's part of the plan. If you're changing the plan, if you're saying I had planned to study for 3 months and now I'm not going to, you had a bad plan. So what I tell students is, yeah, if you're burned out, take a break. But when you come back, don't be overcommitted. Come back with a sustainable plan. This reminds me so much of fitness. How many people in January are going to have the New Year's resolution to get in shape? And how many of those people will work out all through January only to quit through in February? Many, many people. And I know because that was me for many, many years. And over the past year, I have been able to build a very sustainable fitness regime. And it's because I don't work out that much every day. I work out, I don't stress myself enough so that I can't do it the next day. It's not so miserable to me that I'm unwilling to do it every day. So I have developed a habit, a lifestyle of fitness that doesn't need breaks. I'm not working my body to the point of exhaustion, or at least not often enough to where I have to take a complete break from my fitness routine. So my suggestion to you guys is slow down. You don't need breaks if your pace is reasonable from the beginning. Don't have unreasonable expectations. Everyone hears that and then they ignore me and they say, yeah, but I have to take the test in January. You don't. That's an artificial goal that you have established. The goal should be, I have to get a great LSAT score and learn these skills, even if it takes a long time. All right, so that's my tip about taking breaks. Don't take breaks. Design a sustainable lifestyle that makes you a strong reader and a strong test taker. That's why we call our podcast LSAT Life. We don't call it LSAT Score or LSAT Hacks, which is taken, of course, or LSAT Demon. We call it LSAT Life because we think that the route to enlightenment is a lifestyle that builds the skills. Okay, on to point two, do some untimed sections. This one I wanted to do like a face palm. Who isn't doing untimed sections? If the only thing you're doing is time tests, you've made a huge mistake in your prep. So I don't, but I also don't think that the reason that it's good advice, right? You should do untimed sections, of course, but it's devoid of context. The fact that you get to a plateau and haven't done any untimed sections means someone lied to you right from the beginning and they didn't help you design a successful study schedule. Your study plan should entail timed and untimed sections throughout the entire process from beginning to end because it's a time test. You have to take time tests in order to understand the time dynamic of the test. But you won't be able to build more robust strategies if you only do time tests. And so you always have to follow up your time tests with blind review, or at least I think it is extraordinarily valuable to do the section untimed without knowing the correct answers so that you can try to see if other strategies will get you to the right answers and how to refine your approach in distinguishing right answers from wrong ones. Here's what I find to be really bad about looking up your answers. As soon as you know the right answer, all of your thinking becomes post hoc rationalization. How can I make arguments for that answer? How can I prop that one up? And how can I criticize all of the rest? But when you're doing a time test, you don't know which answer you're supposed to be propping up and which one you're supposed to be criticizing. You have to be able to do both things for all answers. You have to be able to look at an answer and say, here's what's good and here's what's bad. Not just it's wrong because and it's right because. Every answer has to be it's good because of this and bad because of that. Then you make the comparison at the end of that analysis. But too many people are jumping right toward it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. What if there's no good answer choice? Now you have no basis of comparison because you were purely critical about every answer choice. Okay, step three, change up your study structure. This one's good advice. It's, again, analogous to fitness. If you have a fitness program and you do it habitually, your body will eventually get used to it and it will stop producing the results that you want. So you have to change it. You have to work out more or use heavier weights or do different exercises to get your body to respond because it's become resistant to the methods that you've used in the past. I think the same thing applies to your brain. Whatever method you've been studying that has you locked into that plateau, you have to change it up. And for many people, they'll say, well, I don't know what to do. I think triple review is the right thing to do. You should slow down. Going fast isn't getting you past the plateau. Go slow. Study the test more deeply. Think more carefully about your decision tree and why you're making the choices that you're making. Back out of the test and start doing more metacognition, which is advice point number 4, analyze your past practice tests. If you're only doing time tests, though, or only analyzing your timed results, you don't have as much data as you could. If you do a time section, follow it up with blind review, meaning you don't know the correct answers, but you repeat the questions with unlimited time. Now you have far more data when you analyze your results, because you'll be able to tell whether your mistakes were due to timing or whether your mistakes were due to fundamental misunderstanding of the logic. I have sympathy for students who don't know the logical forms. I want to teach it to them. But what I frequently don't know when they come to me is whether they missed a question because they were pressed for time or because they need a deeper conceptual logical form. If they do blind review, I'll know. I'll say, did you miss it on blind review? And if they say, yeah, I missed it even on blind review, well, then I know, well, then you didn't get it. It's not a timing issue. We have to go back and really slowly work through what is the logic here. So analyzing past practice tests, sure, that's fine, but you should have a way of taking practice tests that enables you to gather more data than you get from just timed or just untimed tests. I think the same is true for untimed tests. If you're doing sections untimed, without the benefit of the timed section first, it's really hard to take your strategies and say, well, would that work on a timed test? Would that have given me more efficiencies on a timed test? How do you know? You don't know what it was like to do that question timed. Okay, point 5, focus on perfecting logic games, LR, then RC. If you've hit a score plateau, you're sort of past this. This is like beginner advice. If you haven't mastered logic games, though, I agree. It's really hard to understand the logical forms of LR unless you understand in deduction, how to prove things in logic games. If you get that, then you can move on to LR, because LR is testing your ability to see broken logical forms. It would be, I view LR like this. It's kind of like a logic game where they give you the wrong answers. They tell you which one of the following must be true, and then they tell you something that's wrong. And then they ask you, how come that's wrong? Why is that answer incorrect? That's sort of the gist of every LR question. Here's an argument, it's wrong, now tell me why. If you haven't become very good at logic games, you won't be able to determine how the argument should have looked, how you could prove that kind of conclusion. And so then it's really hard to say why it's wrong. And RC is just a combination of all the skills. It's several LR stimuli in a row related to one another, kind of more like those comparative LR stimuli that used to appear. Well, I guess they still do on the disagree questions. So RC, I view to be sort of a synthesis of all the skills. And if you haven't perfected logic games, taking some time to master that will give you a leg up in your LR studies. And if you haven't really mastered LR, taking the time to do that will give you a leg up in your RC studies. The last piece of advice on this website that I was looking at was the worst of the 6. Don't stress, but call us for help. Don't stress. It's so trite. This test will determine your future to some extent. It determines your ability to pursue a profession that you dream about. If it doesn't produce stress, I would wonder if you really cared about pursuing that profession. It should produce stress. But the question we have to ask is, do you have effective techniques for managing that stress? And here's where I think a lot of people are lacking too. I have people who tell me, I have severe test anxiety. I think one of the primary antidotes to that is an exposure therapy. You should be doing lots and lots of timed tests so that the process is very familiar to you. Then, yes, there's going to be extra stress on the real test day because you know that it matters, but it's not the normal stress plus the extra stress. It's just the extra stress because you've already worked through the normal stress of time tests. That's another reason why I think triple review is so important. I don't tell students, learn the skills and we'll worry about the time test later. getting really comfortable, being uncomfortable is part of the process. I want them to feel that stress from beginning to end every week. I want them to feel a lot of timed test stress to get over it. All right, one more slide and I'll open it up to questions. Here's another website that I found that had 3 bullet points, not 6, but I thought they were also good and bad, good advice, but totally devoid of context. Start journaling which questions you miss and why. A wrong answer journal was this website solution to a score plateau. Focusing on mistakes is a really interesting thing because your mistakes are the only opportunities you really have to grow, or I should say the best opportunities you have to grow, really the only ones. But when I say mistake, I also mean a question you got right for the wrong reason, which is often difficult to identify as a mistake. So, those don't show up as questions that you miss. In other words, the questions you miss aren't your only mistakes, which is one reason why I think a wrong answer journal is a little bit incomplete. I didn't have a good solution to this though. Well, then what should a student do? I also think the wrong answer journal is a little misguided because it's focused on the negativity. It's focused on the things you're doing poorly so that you can constantly remind yourself how poorly you're doing those things. That doesn't sound like a good recipe for improvement to me. So what I prefer instead of a wrong answer journal is an action plan journal. If you go to my infographics on triple review, step 3 of triple review is strategy planning, where I ask my students to document their action plan for the next time section. I don't just want them to dream it up in their head or assume they know what to do on the next test. I want them to write down 1 or 2 things, affirmative things that they're going to do that will improve their score. And I have a formula for this. When blank occurs, the trigger, I'm going to do blank. And it always has to be an affirmative, concrete thing, never an avoidance of some negative thing. When I encounter conditional logic, if that's your weakness, I will skip the question if that's your antidote. When I encounter, or if you're more skilled, when I encounter conditional logic, I will slow down to diagram or whatever helps you negotiate that weakness. That's what goes on your action plan in strategy planning. If you're actually doing this, if you're actually documenting those the way that we recommend, then it's not that hard to keep a journal of them. You just document them in a dedicated place. That I think is extremely valuable. Because if you go back through your strategy plans, you'll notice one of 2 things. You'll either notice that you are consistently growing, even if your scores aren't showing improvement. In other words, the reasons that you missed questions are not recycling. It continues to be new things that you're doing wrong. Or you'll learn that when you think you've solved a problem, it tends to resurface. And you'll see the same things on several action plans in a row or several that are spaced out. And then okay, I've got a deep problem here. Those strategies aren't sticking. And how figure out ways to make those strategies more concrete. More practice is basically the antidote. All right, so point number 2, ask yourself whether you're actually sure you know what you're doing. That one was so trite to me. I thought, well, no, students don't know what they're doing. And what's more is that they don't know what they're doing. It's you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. So how are you going to figure it out? Part of strategy planning does entail reaching out to experts you trust, but I think that that's a crutch if you do it too soon in the process. So the asterisk at the bottom of our triple review cards says that you reach out to strategy guides, or you review strategy guides, you talk to tutors, you look at forums, but you do that after steps 1 and 2, after the time section, after the blind review, because that enables you to tease out as much as you know. And if you can get to the end of the rope and figure out everything you know, then when you look at those explanations, you can bridge the gap and say, okay, here's the small portion that I didn't know. But when you reach to those explanations too soon, they fill in the whole gap, even the stuff you could have figured out on your own. And that doesn't create as concrete of a memory as you pushing your limit to the end and then needing the resource to fill in the last step. All right, finally, step 3, they say, oh, develop a strategic approach to each section. That's not something you do when you hit a plateau. That should be something that you do every time you study the LSAT. That's part of strategy planning. So I want to talk for one more minute about strategy planning. At the end of the day, none of your studying matters if you don't do something differently on the next test. And so I have my students come up with that action item. When blank occurs, a trigger, the trigger has to be, how do you know you're about to make whatever mistake you're prone to? You can't think about it 100% of the time, right? Don't miss the negation, don't miss the negation, don't miss the negation throughout the whole 35 minutes of the section. That's absurd. You have to understand, when is that mistake occurring, and develop a trigger. When blank happens, I'm going to run a new program, but only in this one instance. When does the advice apply? Now that we have the trigger, you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do differently to avoid the wrong result? For example, I'll give you guys something that is persistent in my mistakes. Even this, with this much prep, I still tend to make this particular mistake. If the answer choice is very good at the beginning, but goes off the rails at the end, I'm more likely to miss it, especially if I'm preparing quickly for class and there's really no stakes to whether I get the question right or not. I'm just reviewing them to make sure I'm familiar for class, basically. So when that happens, I always remind myself, oh yeah, that's my tendency to read too quickly. So my trigger has to be when I get to the answer choices, because that's where I tend to make that mistake. I don't read the arguments too quickly. I find the arguments to be quite fascinating. I rarely diagram a rule incorrectly on a logic game. There's other issues that just don't plague me, but that one does, and it only happens on the answer choices. So I don't go around thinking, read carefully, read carefully, read carefully. That's a distraction. What I think about is, when I get to the answer choices, now we do this different thing. Now I have to slow down and I have to make sure that I read every sentence to the period, to the end of the answer choice. It's a different reading skill that I don't employ on reading comp passages, that I don't employ in other contexts. So there's an example of a strategic approach. What I think is a bad strategic approach is trying to say, give it to me, Power Score. Tell me how to do everything, and then I will do all of that. Far, far too much to remember. I think you're better off identifying individual errors that you're prone to making, crafting a really narrowly tailored strategy for just that, and spending an entire section hammering that home. I will not pick an answer that I haven't read carefully to the end. I will not pick an answer that I have not read carefully to the end. I might make a dozen mistakes on that practice test, but I will not pick an answer that I haven't read carefully to the end, even if it costs me points in other ways. I don't care about the score. I care about building the skill of reading the answer choices to the end before I pick an answer. You see how I'm very deliberate about that? Even if I'm allowing other problems to creep in, I have to fix that problem. I'll mop up the others later. That'll be my next session for strategy planning. But if I don't fix that problem, what have I done? So that's what I preach to students. You pick something that you want to wrestle with and you beat it. And that gives you the model for how to beat it again, so that you don't have to be so deliberate about it over and over and over again. You just learn to follow that script. You've proven, okay, that works. Now I can take my eyes off that and focus on a different problem. All right, that's strategy planning, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording because not everybody wants their questions on YouTube. Oh, did I do it right? Is everyone still here? I thought I ended the meeting. Okay. Wait, no, I didn't stop the recording. Give me 1 second to figure out how to do it.